Welcome to this talk for the Norfolk Historic Buildings Group. This time I will be showing you some details of Lime Tree and Poachers Cottages in Hempnall, two of the houses we surveyed as part of our latest study of the houses of Norfolk. On the face of it, they appear similar in style and construction, but as we will see, this is not quite the case. Their history also appears to be similar, both built as a single dwelling, divided into two later, and finally restored to single-family occupation. Hempnall is about 10 miles south of Norwich. It is located on the flat, heavy boulder clay of the Beccles series of central Norfolk, which stretches southwards into Suffolk, and it sits on the slightly higher land astride the county watershed. Derived from manorial records and by subsequent landscape analysis, this map shows the land use of Hempnall at around 1500. The common land at this time is shown coloured yellow. The dark green shows the woodland that still existed in 1500, unlike so many Norfolk parishes where it disappeared. The larger woodland area to the south of the parish was originally a deer park, and the red dots show named tenements with houses from the 14th century manorial records. The very strong manorial control at Domesday and before declined over time. Hempnall's main manor, once owned by the king, was selling off parts of its domain land in the 16th century to local yeoman farmers. This allowed some of them to increase their holdings, gain prosperity, which allowed them to build the houses that we see today. The red dots here show the 16th to 18th century properties we were invited to survey, and those in blue were ones we did not manage to see inside. Lime Tree Cottage sits on the south side of the street between the village centre, with its church and medieval marketplace, and the likely site of the original fairground at the western end of the main street. Lime Tree Cottage was originally known as Tofties with various spellings, and was first mentioned in 1387 in the manor records. At this time it had 1 acre of land. This holding gradually increased until by 1600 it held 50 acres. But as poorer times arrived, the house was divided into two cottages in the 18th century, probably in the 1780s. This fate struck virtually every house in the town, apart from two notable exceptions in the Old Vicarage and Crons Manor. Some of them were divided into 3 units or more. Lime Tree Cottage is a thatched 3-celled building of 1.5 stories, with an off-centre chimney stack with 4 flues, the top of which was rebuilt in the late 18th century. The front entrance is away from the stack in the old cross passage position on the right, now covered by the porch. In the mid-20th century it looked like this, with a half-brick thick skin sitting on an older and wider brick plinth, but otherwise looking very similar to today, except with 2 front doors and no window in the flank wall. It can be seen that it has been rendered subsequently, and the mullioned window has reappeared in the end wall. More of that later. The second door at the left-hand side of the front wall has been blocked and is now covered by foliage. The house sits about 1/3 of the way down the shallow slope from the street to the fledgling river Tass at the bottom of the garden. The river is shallow and narrow at this point, but it always flows, and it is thought that flat-bottomed boats could always have reached up to the west end of the village. This is the view from the northeast from the street itself. From the southeast, the single-storey lean-to extension can be seen, probably the 18th or 19th century. The presence of one shallow window below the wall plate suggests that the one on the left was also once like this and was shifted upwards, breaching the wall plate when the extension was built. The one in the centre lights the cupboard adjacent to the stack and is above the wall plate completely. Both of the windows in the front wall have breached the wall plate. From the southwest, the modern extension appears, and also the single-flued stack on the western wall, which probably dates from the division into 2 units in the 18th century. Moving inside, in each of the following slides, the position from which the photo was taken is shown in the floor plan at the top of the screen. These photos were taken over several visits during a survey period of over 6 years, so there may be noticeable changes in both furnishings and decoration. Starting here in the hall, looking towards the wall between the hall and the service rooms, in the centre are the 2 doors into the 2 service rooms, one now blocked and the other heightened. To the left is another door which allows access to a staircase which is in its original position. We found similar staircases in the service bay in 4 other properties in Hempnall. Looking the other way towards the fireplace, the stack is built in English bond brickwork, but with one odd on-edge course. There does not appear to be any reason for this, as the 2 courses laid normally are the same thickness as one laid on edge. The principal joist is of substantial size, but is fairly knotty in character. It is a plain chamfer with chamfer stops that have suffered insect damage. Common joists are flat laid with diminished haunch soffit tenons into the principal and are not chamfered. They rest on the rails at either end rather than being jointed into them, a typical Norfolk feature. It can be seen that the common joists are actually above the end rails, and an effort has been made to level the floor. And this is the result of a ceiling raise achieved by inserting oak blocks on top of the original notch positions in the story posts. The tenon appears to have been removed to achieve this, but the original mortise still exists in the story post, and the whole is strengthened with an iron tie. The mantel beam displays one deep taper burn just to the right of its centre, and a hole and shallow mortise to the right for an anchor for the chimney crane, for moving the pot on and off the heat. There are a few small but deep burn marks in this house, only one on the mantel beams and a few close to windows, but nowhere near as many as in some of the other houses we surveyed. In the service rooms, the timbers are slighter in size. The joists are flat laid and rest on the rails at both ends. The small fireplace feeds into the external stack outside the western end of the house. As I said, probably part of the 18th century division into 2 units. Looking across the service room towards the staircase, a Samson post is introduced to deal with the deflection of the joist, above which is an inserted wall, creating a separate room. In the central joist are empty mortises for the studs for the dividing wall between the 2 original service rooms. Moving into the parlour at the eastern end of the house, this became the main room for 1 unit when the house was divided into 2. The principal joist is of similar quality to that in the hall, with a plain chamfer and shield stops. Although the shield stops here are slightly unusual in that they are slightly scalloped, not a feature we found anywhere else in Hempnall. The common joists are flat laid, jointed into the principal joist with similar diminished haunch soffit tenons, and they rest on the rails at the other end. The ceiling has not been raised in this room. With the conversion into 2 units, this half became one of the main cooking spaces, hence the anchor point for the chimney crane for the pot. There are no burn marks on this mantel beam, and it has a shallow chamfer stopped by simple shield stops. The external door to the second unit seen earlier was here. And this steep staircase made of pine was inserted to enable access upstairs in this unit. Looking towards the eastern end, the window we first saw covered in brick in the 1950s photograph. Looking at the windows downstairs in more detail, the one we have just seen in the parlour has its mullions fully pegged into both sill and head, as is the sill into the studs, so it is in its original position. The mullions are rebaited to take glass, and there is no evidence of a shutter slide. This is the window in the hall in the front wall of the house next to the front door. It too has mullions of a similar shape to those in the parlour, although rather more insect damaged. They are also rebaited to take glass and are fully pegged in, as is the sill and head. Whereas the window in the rear wall opposite has diamond-shaped mullions of an unglazed window, again with no evidence of shutters, either hinged or sliding. This points to another reason for glazing the parlour and front windows, one of showing off. At a time when glass was not cheap, the owner obviously could not afford to glaze all round, so glass was fitted in the windows that could be seen from outside, leaving the one window most vulnerable to the rain-bearing southwesterly winds without glass and apparently without shutters. Moving upstairs to the chamber above the service rooms that houses the stairs. The wall which apparently caused the deflection of the joist downstairs requiring the Samson post just appears in the right of the picture. All four corners of this house are braced with internally trenched inverted arch or swag braces. The other corner is similarly braced with the brace marks with the race cut knife 3, and will return to carpenter's marks later. The windows in both pictures are late insertions, as there is evidence of the remains of a shutter slide in the soffit of the tie beam, indicating the original window position below it, shown by the green arrow on the floor plan. The hall chamber was divided into two when the house was originally built, with a full partition, seen on the right, built over the principal joist in the hall below. Lime Tree Cottage is the only three-celled house of the period that we surveyed that had not had a corridor inserted upstairs at the side of the house. This would have allowed private access to each of the chambers. Most of those that had had a corridor inserted also had had their eaves raised, increasing headroom and making a side corridor more usable. Without a corridor, in order to achieve through access, the doorway has been cut through the wall and the tie beam of each of the chambers. The increase in headroom gained over ducking beneath the tie beam is only about 25 centimetres or so, and still requires anyone of normal stature to duck quite low. All the joints are pegged, but it is unclear when this was done, although there is a possible explanation which we will explore in a moment. The untidy nature of the other side of the joint indicates that it was done after the oak had hardened, and accurate joint cutting, presumably in situ, was difficult. However, the dovetails do seem to retain the integrity of the tie beam, as there is no apparent deflection in the wall plates and widening of the house that we have found in many of the houses where tie beams have been cut through. The dating of these heightened doorways is further complicated by the decoration of 4 of the 8 door jambs. 2 of the frames are made up of timber which may once have been a high quality principal joist and reused here. If it is, it has been cut in 2 lengthways and across to provide 4 door jambs. The timber is fairly straight grained, relatively knot free, and is of better quality than the other timber in the building. It has a plain chamfer terminated with an elongated shield stop followed by a deep notch or nick. This type of chamfer stop is normally considered to be around or after 1625 in Norfolk, which, if it is a reuse, would date the changes to some time after that. This is an example of the other 2 door frames, with less prepared timber, more in keeping with that in the remainder of the frame. The new door frames are most unlikely to have been part of the division into 2 cottages in the 18th century, firstly because this was a downgrade rather than upgrade in the use of the house, and secondly because the second of these doorways, the one next to the chimney stack, shown on the left of the pair at the top, would have been blocked off as part of the division into 2 units. There was one period when the house might have been upgraded. It was lived in by the Hempnall vicar for a short period between 1643 and 1646, after which he was sequestered for royalist and anti-Protestant preaching. Could his occupation have warranted improvements and the creation of heightened doorways? It does seem close to the likely date of the chamfer stops, which would make the use of this timber its first use rather than a reuse. The parlour chamber is a carbon copy of the service chamber with its sizable braces and original window position below the tie beam. There is partial evidence of the remains of a shutter slide groove here, but no peg holes for mullions. As at the other end of the house, this rail indicated provides the base support for the rafters of the half-hipped end. The hearth in this room has a very shallow brick arch with roughly hand-cut chamfers on the bricks of the arch itself. The two door heads on either side appear to be part of a tie beam, are in fact two short rails placed above the severed tie beam to give extra headroom in the same way as the raised doorways seen earlier. This shows clearly when seen from outside the room, with the stack to the right of the picture. Note that the studs are not pegged into this new rail, which itself is not jointed into the principal rafter. The similar quality of the frame timbers and this door frame, and the difference from the chamfered door jambs in the centre two doorways, can be seen again clearly here. The raised ceiling height in the hall below can be seen in the step up through the door on the other side of the stack, indicated by the arrow. Looking at the roof, it is a typical late 16th or early 17th century roof, but with three rows of purlins. The middle one is wide and shallow and is clasped by the collar. There is a small ridge piece. The principal rafters are diminished in size above the collar and pairs of arched braces that support every principal rafter. The top row of purlins are supported by bird's mouth collars, and the lowest row of purlins form the anchor points for the ceiling joists. The rustic nature of the roof timbers is obvious, some of the rafters barely more than poles, and the chalk graffiti seen on the purlin is dated June the 30th, 1882. With apologies for the blurred photo, but it shows some of the many additional support struts inserted into the roof, some of them very recent. Finally, looking directly upwards at the hipped end of the roof, with the front and back of the roof to the sides of the photo, shows the end of the third row of purlins, the one with the bird's mouth collars between them. This explains their role in that the third row of purlins provides support for a rail which supports the rafters of the hipped ends. Sorry for a complicated sentence. Looking at some of the internal fittings, starting with doors. From the back, this door appears to be a standard battened three-plank door with two wider planks at the sides and a narrower one in the centre, with using turned-over nails through the battens to act like rivets. But whilst the front displays the typical creases and chamfers of a three-plank door, arrowed, it has two additional V-grooves cut into it to match the later V-groove doors in the house, and the nail heads have been disguised by wooden plugs. The cupboard door in the parlour chamber displays 7 blocked keyholes. Not the most we saw in Hempnall. There were 2 doors with 10, although they were in more public areas of the house rather than in the main chamber. This certainly seems to comment on the need for privacy, but were they to protect from those outside the household or those within it too? This splendid door latch is on the inside of the parlour chamber door. That is not one of the later door frames. One interesting feature is the saltire cross made of punched dots that cover the gap between the door and the frame. This feature is found on some older church locks in Norfolk, but this is the first house I've ever seen one in. One other small apotropaic mark was seen in the house on the door frame in the bathroom to the service chamber, a shallow scratched compass-drawn rose. Linda Hall has 2 dated examples in her book of this sort of latch, but it is an original. If this is an original fitting, it could stretch the date in her book back 30 years or so. On the back of the 3-plank door we saw earlier is the remains of a handmade strap hinge replaced by a more modern version. At the top of the same door is a longer version with a fancy plate. The straps are sufficiently different in form to have been made by different smiths. Moving on to carpenter's marks, the western end wall, i.e. the service chamber, shows that the braces and studs have different numbering sequences. We found this in a couple of other houses in Hempnall, but not in most of them. The 8 corner braces appear to be numbered 1 to 8, although marks could not be found on the faces of a couple of them, and the studs here are numbered 1 to 5. In the eastern end of the north wall, the brace is numbered 4, whilst there appears to be more than one sequence of numbers for the remaining joints, duplicating some of them, at least the 10. This side of the house has tags appended to the number to differentiate them from the south wall. On the south wall, and here the image has been flipped so that the bays and numbering can be compared to the north wall, again the brace, ringed, is part of a separate sequence, but the stud numbers appear to be out of sequence, and again it duplicates some of the numbers used, including the 6 or V1. The numbering may reflect the order in which the joists were cut, so do not necessarily need to be in a positional sequence, but they do need to be unique. And here 2 studs have the same number, are within 2 meters of each other, shown here as V1. Going back to the marks on the north wall, this one is 13 tag, identifying it as located on the north wall. And next to it is number 14, with the tag missing due to insect damage. One of the tie beams had the numbers 3 and 4 cut into it, apparently for stud joints, although they are in the centre of the rail rather than near the top or the bottom. But the 3 has been pierced by a hole, perhaps for a peg, presumably meaning that the number was cut before the peg hole was drilled. Four of the main frames here are shown in sequence, the middle 2 showing 2 of the 3 severed tie beams. Together they make up Lime Tree Cottage. This isometric projection pulls the whole house together. Some of the timbers have been omitted for clarity, but it shows how complete it is and how much of the original still exists, despite the subsequent division into 2 units and the later brick cladding. It shows the glazed window of the parlour and front wall of the house and the unglazed window at the rear. The original form and exact position of the upstairs windows is not clear, so they've been omitted, except where the wall plates have been breached. Lime Tree Cottage was one of 40 or so houses we surveyed in Hempnall. Detailed examination of many of them meant that they revealed a history or origin that was unexpected at the start of the project, but not in this case. It is exactly as it appears, a late 16th century house built in the transitional period between open halls and with cross-passage entrances and later lobby entry houses. Previous examples in Norfolk would place this probably in the 3rd quarter of the 16th century. This is the only one of the houses we looked at in Hempnall which did not have a later corridor inserted to allow private access to all the chambers. In another one of the houses it was inserted as late as 1959. The landholding belonging to Lime Tree Cottage grew during the 15th and 16th centuries to amount to 50 acres in 1600 in the manorial records, amounting to a fairly prosperous holding. The glazed windows are possibly a confirmation of this. It was lived in by the vicar for a short period in the middle of the 17th century, which may explain the apparent improvements to the access doorways upstairs. But by the later 18th century, and possibly earlier, the house had been divided into two units, like so many houses during the agricultural downtimes. Although this was prevalent in the houses of the town of Hempnall, we only found evidence of this happening in one of the farmhouses sited round the greens south of Hempnall. Thankfully, it has been restored to single-family occupation with sympathy. But there are still some unanswered questions. Unfortunately, we were not able to investigate whether the timber here would have been suitable for dendro sampling. Many of the other houses we investigated proved to have been built with fast-grown oak and some elm, neither of which is capable of producing a date currently. At the time of recording, the COVID pandemic has prevented any actual dendro work, but the VAG has provided a grant to help fund this work, for which the NHBG is grateful. One of the aims of the Hempnall study was to test whether W.G. Hoskin's suggestion that there was a great rebuilding of the housing stock during the 60 years or so spanning the end of the 16th century. This house and 29 others we surveyed were built new during this period, and 5 others were converted from the earlier form of open hall house, with a further 6 built later. So the houses of Hempnall can definitely be said to be part of that great rebuilding. With thanks to the owners for their patience with our visits and allowing us access to their home, Lime Tree Cottage is worthy of appearing on the lid of any chocolate box. Moving on to Poachers Cottage, this was one of the 16 houses we studied around the greens, mainly to the south of the parish. Most of them were farmhouses that farmed the increasingly enclosed land, some with relatively large holdings. Unlike many farmhouses, those in Hempnall were not subdivided during the lean times in the mid-19th century. But Poachers Cottage, in contrast, never had more than 1 acre of land attached to it. It was first mentioned in the manor records, which came into new ownership and restarted in 1622, in 1634. At that time it had a garden and half an acre of land in Town Field, just to the west of the cottage. But as we will see, the house is obviously older than mid-17th century. In 1691, 2 differently named occupants were mentioned in one entry in the records, and by the 1780s it was described as a double cottage. This is Poachers Cottage seen from the southeast. And from the west, here the difference in ridge heights in the 2 halves of the house is more noticeable. Edwin Rose of the Norfolk Archaeological Unit noted on the Historic Environment record his thoughts that the different ridge heights meant that the left-hand side of the house was a 2-storey parlour end, and the lower ridge to the right was, or had been, a single-storey hall. As we will see, this is not the case, so his assessment must have been made without the benefit of an internal inspection. From the south, the wrap-round brick gable shows an enlarged window on the ground floor under a narrow original arch, and a blocked doorway beneath the wooden nameplate on the right. This was the entrance to the second unit in the house. The 3rd-storey window must always have been blind, as it is intersected by the upper-storey ceiling. At the northern end is a Victorian single-storey extension with a ridged roof, which replaced the original single-storey lean-to extension. The porch and current lobby entry shown in the bottom picture right were created in 1959 by the current owner, when the house was purchased and converted back to a single unit. This entrance replaced the original opposed entrances near the far corner. The floor plan shows that the room to the right, the one with a higher roof ridge said to be the parlour end, is in fact the hall of a 2-celled house with a single-storey lean-to service bay to the right, accessed through a single door indicated by the red arrow. This has now been replaced by a larger extension, but there is still faint evidence of the fixing, sorry about the clock, for the lean-to roof. The original opposed entry doors, both now blocked and shown speckled, can be seen adjacent to the hall service wall on the right, indicated by the pecked arrows. The eastern door at the bottom end was blocked in 1959 and replaced by the lobby entry door marked by the solid arrow. The almost full-width stack separates the hall from the larger parlour. As with all the houses we surveyed, the following photographs were taken during several visits to the house over the length of the project, so there are some changes to decoration and furniture. Inside the hall, looking at the northern wall to the services, the single door is arrowed, where the widening of the opening is noticeable, along with the empty peg holes for the door head. The modern door into the extension is on the left and steps over a deep sill. The cut-through sill shown here indicates the position of the original door. The fact that the sill beam is at ground floor level confirms this to have always been an internal wall rather than it being placed on a plinth above ground for an external wall. The white arrow indicates the position of the original entrance door, and the notch in the principal joist used to house a Samson post support the joist when the window was cut through the wall place below its joint with the principal joist, until 1959 when the wall was strengthened and the Samson post removed. The principal joist has a deep plain chamfer with shield stops, which are unusually cut at a different angle from the chamfer itself. The common joists are flat laid and are also chamfered with elongated shield stops. The chamfering indicate a fairly high quality when built. Looking towards the hearth, the door to the steep stairs is on the right. The mantel beam is slightly cranked, chamfered and stopped with shield stops that fit the width of the opening. There are a pair of holes for the mounting of the chimney crane for swinging pots over the fire. The scratched marks you see are the only marks on this beam. There are no burn marks. This picture of the west wall shows that we were surveying just before Christmas this time, with crackers on the table. The principal joist at its western end sits on an integral carved support in the story post, as well as a mortise and tenon and reinforcing iron strap. As at the other end, the shield stop is carved at a different angle to the remainder of the chamfer. The arrow indicates the bottom of the corner brace down from the wall plate and shows that there is no middle rail or girt in this wall. Below it is one of the original entrance doors and is now filled by a window. The stud in between displays a collection of burn marks, constituting the majority of them in this house. Unlike in many of the houses in Hempnall, which had multiple burn marks spread throughout the house, especially on mantel beams and by windows. The current access into the house, on the left of the photo, was created in 1959, and access through to the parlour was also created then. Until then, there was no way through to the room the other side of the stack. Also notice the step down into the parlour. The parlour floor is below external ground level and has flooded in the past. Presumably the floor was excavated to increase headroom, but even so, I still cannot stand easily in this room. In the opposite direction is a small enclosure in the corner which housed the staircase for the second unit until 1959. The principal joist in this room is additionally supported by applied carved brackets at both ends. The chamfer stops at this end have been damaged by insects, but at the other end, simple shield stops remain. The scribing marks for the common joist joints have been deeply scribed over the full height of the principal, including over its chamfer. In all the other houses we saw, they were much shorter and far less deeply marked. The width of the hearth here is noticeable, and with a recently replaced mantel beam and a herringbone pattern of bricks at the back, which again is different from any other we found in Hempnall. There are two separate principal joists by the stack, one embedded in it and the other higher one in front of it. Initially this made us think of an inserted stack not quite filling its bay, and to reconsider Edwin Rose's assessment as an open hall house, later floored over, of which more later. Within the stack is a bread oven which appears to have been rebuilt, perhaps when this became the main cooking point for the second unit in the house. Upstairs, looking at the northern wall, the rail immediately above the window supports the hipped end of the roof. Substantial braces in the corners extend below the floor level, as we saw in the hall below. The roof at this end of the house has a single set of side purlins, which also form the anchor for the ceiling joists. Just visible at the top of the picture is the collar, which does not clasp the purlins. The 4 studs between the wall plate and the roof rail have the only carpenter's marks we found in this house, numbered 1 to 4 in sequence. In other houses in Hempnall we found many more carpenter's marks, and in some cases, as in Lime Tree Cottage, there were different sequences for the numbering of studs and braces. Unfortunately, there is no access to the roof space in this house. The window has mortices for diamond mullions for a 5-light window, but there is no shutter slide above it, so either the mullions had rebates and were glazed, or it was windy with a less permanent covering. Looking towards the stack, it can be seen that the tie beam has been cut through to allow access from the stair by the stack. The central chamber has one dormer window and a small one below the wall plate, suggesting that the dormer is not an original feature. The corner next to the stack is fully braced, as you can see. This end of the house has 2 rows of purlins, and the tie beam supports a post which rises to the lower purlin, rather like a queen post roof, and it can be seen that this frame is set in front of the stack. This mirrors the suggestion noted earlier that this house is not as straightforward as it seems, and we will return to this issue. In the end chamber there is little timber visible, as the gable wall to the right and its wrap-round ends are of brick right up to the right-hand stud. In this room, an additional rustic bird's-mouthed collar has been used to support the upper row of purlins, and the ceiling at this end of the building is set above collar level. Turning to the west side of the house, it has similar bracing to the chamber on the eastern side. The difference in height of the wall plates on either side of this frame is obvious, as well as their difference in quality of the timber. This is another clue to the complicated building history here. The plate on the right of the picture is side axe cut, as we will see closer on the next screen, and the timber on the left is sawn square and insect damaged. As part of the Hempnall project, Ian Tyers examined timbers in several buildings to assess them as possible dendro candidates. It was this examination that pointed out the major difference between the 2 halves of the house here. The northern part is built in oak and the southern half is all elm. This is further confirmed by the insect damage to the wall plate in the southern half, where the heartwood has been penetrated by insects, which does not happen in oak unless it has been soaked and the poisonous tannin diluted. Although we did find elm in many of the houses in Hempnall, especially for some of the minor timbers such as joists, Almost all the houses bar Poachers Cottage had all the principal frames and major plates made of oak. Unfortunate too is the fact that the oak used in the northern half is too fast grown to provide sufficient rings for a date, and elm currently has no reference database to compare against, so it is not possible to try for an exact date for either part of this house. This access through between the two halves was created in 1959, including the severing of the tie beam as part of the reunification of the two units. This photo emphasises the axe shaping of the wall plate and highlights the break between the two plates. On the opposite side of the house, the same break of the wall plates occurs, as well as the difference in height. Seen in close-up, the red lines outline the wall plates and the green line outlines the iron strap. These sections through the house, the two on the right from the northern half of the house in oak and the one on the left from the southern half in elm, show the difference in floor levels and a general sense of larger timbers in the northern half, especially the tie beams. The need to sever the tie beams in order to gain access to the upstairs rooms is similar to that in Lime Tree Cottage, although less successfully done here. The careful dovetailing of the joints in Lime Tree Cottage prevented the spreading of the house under its roof load, whereas here the roof load can be seen to have pushed the western upper wall outwards, widening the house by over 15 centimetres or 6 inches. The eastern tie beam was severed historically to get from the stairs to the hall chamber, but one can only imagine the stresses that the severing of the western tie beam in 1959 put on the north wall, as prior to this the western half of the frame was complete. The isometric projection highlights the join between the two halves. The timbers here are only drawn diagrammatically to represent their position rather than their size and particularly their deformation, as this is difficult in a projection. The close-up of the break between the two halves emphasises the gap between them, and that at one time there were two complete frames very close together. The white line here shows on the elevation where that break actually occurs, just to the left of the chimney stack. But we are left with the question as to why there were two completely separate builds. Was this a cheaper rebuild in elm after a disaster such as a fire, or was elm all that was available to the builder at the time? It would be unusual for a fire to burn an entire cell of a building away completely without touching the other half of the house, and the presence of large reserves of oak in the parish right through into the 19th century should have ensured a continuous supply of timber if needed. We cannot date the building of either part through dendro, but the techniques used and the joints used in the southern elm part are similar to those in the northern half, although they are far less decorated. So it is unlikely to have been built too long after the oak part of the house. The northern part of the house to the right is a transitional house of 1.5 stories with opposed entry doors at the low end of the hall and a single-storey lean-to service bay. This sort of layout occurred between the open hall house of the earlier 16th century and the closed lobby entry house of the 17th century, so the oak-built part is probably late 16th century. The parlour end was rebuilt in elm sometime later, but not to exactly the same dimensions, with lower eaves and ridge, but with similar jointing techniques. This must have been done before 1691, when the records first refer to two separate tenants, as the two halves appear never to have been connected internally. It was recombined some 60 years ago into the cottage you see today. So in summary, we have two cottages about 1 kilometre apart, similar in date of build, at least at the beginning, similar in jointing techniques with no mid-rail, similar floor plan, half-hipped roofs, and neither with a real landholding initially. Lime Tree Cottage is slightly larger but less decorated. Its landholding grew during the 16th century, whereas Poachers Cottage didn't. Poachers Cottage was built on the green, not in town. Its timbers are more decorated despite having such a small landholding. Both were divided into 2 units quite early on, whereas many divisions occurred during the mid-19th century, but both of these have been converted back to single-family occupation recently. The research volume detailing this and the other houses in the study, as well as an historical analysis, is available via our website. Thank you for listening.